The aircraft you're about to hear about should not exist. Not in 2026. Not in an era of hypersonic missiles, sixth-generation fighters, and AI-driven warfare. And yet, every single day, it's flying combat missions over 3 continents. Before we go deeper into how a 60-year-old aircraft is even still airworthy, if you're finding this breakdown fascinating, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe. And trust me, what's coming will blow your mind. The KC-135 Stratotanker first took to the skies in 1956. Eisenhower was president. The Soviet Union had just launched Sputnik. The jet age had barely begun. And today, right now, these same aircraft, the same airframes, are refueling B-2 Spirit stealth bombers over the Pacific, supporting F-35 strike packages in the Middle East, and enabling NATO air patrols across Eastern Europe. Every single KC-135 in the sky today is older than the pilots who fly it. Older than the F-22 Raptor. Older than the entire concept of stealth technology. The last one rolled off the production line in 1965. That means the newest KC-135 in active service is 60 years old. 60. And the oldest ones? Pushing 68. And here's the kicker. The United States Air Force plans to keep flying them until 2050. That's not a typo. 25 more years. Aircraft built before the moon landing are still flying missions into the second half of the 21st century. So what does this aircraft actually do? Because the KC-135 isn't some relic they've kept around for nostalgia. It's the single most critical enabler of American global power projection. The KC-135 Stratotanker is a flying gas station. Its mission is aerial refueling. It pumps fuel into fighters, bombers, and transports while cruising at 30,000 feet and 500 miles per hour. Without it, the American combat radius shrinks to a fraction of what it is today. Let me put that in perspective. An F-15E Strike Eagle has a combat radius of about 790 miles without refueling. With a KC-135 feeding it fuel mid-air, that radius extends to over 2,400 miles. A B-2 Spirit bomber flying from Missouri to the Middle East covers roughly 7,000 miles one way. Without aerial refueling, that mission is impossible. The KC-135 uses what's called a flying boom. A rigid, telescoping tube operated by a boom operator sitting or lying prone in the back of the aircraft, staring out a window at the jet behind them. The boom extends 30 feet, locks into the receiving aircraft's refueling receptacle, and starts pumping fuel at up to 1,000 gallons per minute. The KC-135 can offload over 200,000 pounds of JP-8 jet fuel mid-air. And it's not just American aircraft. NATO allies, coalition partners, and even foreign militaries, during joint operations, all plug into KC-135s. But if the KC-135 is 60 years old, built before the moon landing, designed when computers filled entire rooms, how is it even still flying? What's keeping this Cold War relic in the air when everything else from that era is in a museum? Well, this is not a simple story of maintaining old aircraft. In fact, it's one of the most remarkable engineering sustainment programs in military aviation history. The KC-135 flying today is fundamentally different from the KC-135 that first flew in 1956. The KC-135 was built during an era when the US military designed aircraft to be used, abused, repaired, and reused indefinitely. Cold War planning assumed prolonged global conflict and heavy attrition. Aircraft were engineered with massive structural safety margins because failure was not an option when nuclear deterrence depended on airborne readiness. The KC-135 was overbuilt. Its fuselage was thicker than necessary. Its wings were stronger than required. And the Air Force has exploited those margins relentlessly for 6 decades. Original KC-135A models had Pratt & Whitney J57 turbojet engines. Loud, smoky, fuel-hungry engines that guzzled fuel at an alarming rate. But starting in the 1980s, the Air Force launched a massive re-engining program. The vast majority of the fleet was fitted with CFM56 high-bypass turbofan engines. Modern, efficient, commercial-grade power plants derived from engines used on Boeing 737 airliners. These upgraded KC-135A models are 25% more fuel efficient than the originals. 25% cheaper to operate, significantly quieter, and they can offload about 50% more fuel per mission than the early KC-135s could. That's not an incremental improvement. That's a generational leap. But the upgrades didn't stop at engines. The Air Force has systematically modernized avionics, navigation systems, autopilots, and cockpit displays. They've installed satellite communications, Link 16 tactical data links, and advanced radar warning receivers. They've replaced analog instruments with digital glass cockpits. The KC-135 flying today shares almost nothing with the KC-135 that flew in 1956 except the aluminum skin and the basic airframe design. Everything inside has been gutted and rebuilt multiple times. And here's what makes this sustainable. Every structural inspection, every component replacement, every service life extension program feeds data into Air Force sustainment models. The KC-135 has become a living laboratory for how far you can extend an aircraft's operational life through upgrades and maintenance. But that still doesn't explain why it's still here. Because the Air Force has tried, repeatedly, to replace it. And every attempt has been a disaster. The most spectacular failure is happening right now. The KC-46 Pegasus. This aircraft was supposed to end the KC-135 era. It didn't. The KC-46 is derived from the Boeing 767 commercial airliner. Fly-by-wire flight controls. Advanced avionics. Digitally integrated systems. On paper, it's everything the KC-135 isn't. Modern. Efficient. Capable. And yet, it's been plagued by developmental failures that have delayed full operational capability for years. The most infamous problem is the remote vision system. Unlike the KC-135, which uses a boom operator staring out a window at the receiving aircraft, the KC-46 uses cameras and high-definition monitors. The boom operator sits in a chair, staring at screens, controlling the boom remotely. And for years, those cameras didn't work properly. Depth perception issues made it difficult to judge distances accurately. Image quality degraded in certain lighting conditions. Glare from the sun rendered the system nearly useless during daylight operations. The Air Force declared it a Category I deficiency. That's military speak for a critical flaw that directly affects the aircraft's ability to perform its primary mission. For years, Boeing was stuck redesigning the system. The Air Force imposed strict operational restrictions. And the KC-135 kept flying because it worked. Even as fixes are now being delivered, the profound damage to the replacement timeline was already done. But the RVS wasn't the only problem. Structural cracks were discovered in critical airframe components. Deliveries were halted. Inspections expanded. Another delay. Another setback. Another reason the KC-135 couldn't be retired. And here's the bitter irony. The KC-46 was supposed to be low risk. It's based on a proven commercial airliner. The 767 has been flying passengers safely for decades. And yet, adapting it into a tanker introduced complications that Boeing and the Air Force catastrophically underestimated. Meanwhile, the KC-135, with its 1950s-era design and analog boom operator staring out a window, kept generating sorties. Not because it's superior, but because it's predictable. Its limitations are known. Its failure modes are understood. In operational planning, uncertainty is more dangerous than inefficiency. A tanker that always works within known limits is more valuable than one that promises more but delivers less. That's the paradox. The older system wins because it's reliable, not because it's better. This is why the KC-135 is still here. Not because it's the best tanker ever designed, but because it's the most dependable at scale. And in a military that operates globally, continuously, dependability at scale is everything. So if the KC-135 still works, if it's generating sorties, if it's been upgraded and modernized, if it's more reliable than its replacements, why do so many people think keeping it in service is insane? What are critics seeing that makes this look illogical? On the surface, it does look illogical. You're relying on aircraft designed before the moon landing in an era of hypersonic weapons and AI-driven battle spaces. The technology base, despite upgrades, remains rooted in 1950s engineering. Maintenance costs rise as aircraft age. Parts become harder to source. A Government Accountability Office report found that the KC-135 fleet failed to meet availability objectives for multiple consecutive years. Rising operational costs. Degraded systems. In some years, the Air Force operated aircraft with known deficiencies rather than risk capability gaps, accepting increased pilot workload just to keep missions flying. The Stratotanker also lacks modern defensive systems. Limited radar warning receivers. No advanced electronic warfare suite. No missile approach warning system comparable to newer aircraft. It survives in permissive environments. But in a high-end conflict against China or Russia, where advanced air defenses could threaten slow tankers even from standoff distances, the KC-135 would be vulnerable. And then there are the rumors. Social media posts claim structural failures are imminent. Speculation that the Air Force is hiding severe, widespread metal fatigue issues. Warnings that the airframes are reaching their absolute limits. Most of this isn't supported by official reporting. But it reflects genuine distrust of how old equipment is managed when replacement timelines keep slipping. Within defense circles, there's quiet resentment that tanker modernization keeps getting delayed while fighters, bombers, and space systems leap ahead. Some view the KC-135 as a symbol of procurement paralysis. Others see it as proof that the system prioritizes glamorous combat platforms over unglamorous enablers. You'll hear claims that the tanker force is one crisis away from collapse. The Air Force is gambling on metal fatigue not catching up. These statements are exaggerated. But they reflect genuine anxiety about dependence on an aging platform with no clean exit strategy. But here's the reality. Despite the age, despite the concerns, despite the critics, the KC-135 is still doing the job. And it's doing it at an operational scale across the globe. Open-source flight tracking routinely shows dozens of KC-135s flying transatlantic and transpacific routes toward strategic hubs. Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Anderson Air Force Base in Guam. RAF Mildenhall in the United Kingdom. These are real combat deployments supporting extended operations. In the Middle East, KC-135s refuel F-15 Strike Eagles conducting counter-ISIS operations, F-16 Fighting Falcons supporting partner nations, and B-1B Lancers striking high-value targets. In the Indo-Pacific, they enable B-52 bomber task force missions and extend the range of F-35 Lightning II strike packages. In Europe, they refuel NATO fighter patrols along the eastern flank, support rapid reaction alert missions, and enable joint exercises with allied air forces. British Typhoons. French Rafales. Polish F-16s. All of them plug into KC-135s during multinational operations. The aircraft have supported strategic deterrence missions tied directly to nuclear operations. They've enabled bomber task forces that project power across oceans. And they've done all of this while maintaining sortie generation rates that newer platforms struggle to match. Commanders routinely emphasize that without tankers like the KC-135, the Air Force's ability to execute global air power missions would be significantly degraded. Not reduced. Degraded. That's how critical this aircraft remains. Now let's address the elephant in the room. Survivability. Because this is where critics seem strongest, and where the actual logic becomes clearest. The standard criticism goes like this. The KC-135 lacks stealth. It lacks advanced defensive systems. In a high-end war against China or Russia, it would be shot down. And that criticism is factually correct. The KC-135 would not survive deep inside contested airspace. But here's the twist. In a highly contested environment, any large, non-stealthy tanker would be at extreme risk. Not just the KC-46 Pegasus. Not just allied tankers like the Airbus A330 MRTT. Not even a hypothetical stealth tanker. Tankers are large, slow, and fundamentally vulnerable despite varying levels of defensive systems. They operate from standoff distances, protected by layers of defensive assets. Air superiority fighters. AWACS early warning aircraft. Electronic warfare assets. Tankers don't penetrate denied airspace. They loiter in safer zones while fighters and bombers cycle in and out for refueling. The survivability difference between a KC-135 and a KC-46 in a peer conflict is significant on paper, but marginal compared to the inherent vulnerability of the tanker mission itself. Yes, the KC-46 has better defensive aids. But these improvements provide a better chance of surviving a threat, not immunity. What matters more is how many tankers you can deploy across multiple theaters. How quickly you can reposition them. How reliably they can refuel large formations. And whether you have enough to sustain operations if losses occur. In that context, the KC-135 still competes effectively. Not because it's invulnerable, but because vulnerability is already baked into tanker operations regardless of platform. And the KC-135's advantages, massive scale and proven reliability, directly address the real operational problem. Upgrading or replacing the KC-135 doesn't solve the fundamental survivability problem. Only a radically different concept does. Distributed aerial refueling using unmanned systems. Stealth tankers with reduced radar cross-sections. Autonomous tanker swarms. These technologies are being explored. DARPA and the Air Force are investigating unmanned refueling concepts. But all of these are decades away from operational deployment. The engineering challenges are immense. The costs are staggering. Until those technologies mature, the Stratotanker remains strategically good enough. Not perfect. Not ideal. But good enough. Now let's talk about the part nobody wants to say out loud. Money. Because this is where the logic of keeping the KC-135 becomes brutally clear. Replacing the entire KC-135 fleet would cost hundreds of billions of dollars. Not just procurement. Basing infrastructure. Training pipelines. Maintenance facilities. Logistics networks. Spare parts inventories. All of it rebuilt from scratch. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Tankers don't generate public enthusiasm. They don't win elections. They don't inspire Hollywood movies. They're invisible to everyone except the people who depend on them. Every dollar spent on a tanker is a dollar not spent on stealth fighters, hypersonic missiles, or aircraft carriers. Those platforms generate headlines. They win political support. They drive defense budgets. This has repeatedly pushed tanker recapitalization down the priority list. Not because military leaders don't understand that tankers are critical, but because tankers aren't glamorous. And in defense procurement, glamour often wins over necessity. But here's the twist. The KC-135 wasn't supposed to last this long. Not even close. What kept it flying wasn't just engineering or economics. It was politics. Congress has directly and repeatedly influenced retirement policies for the KC-135 fleet. In multiple budget cycles, lawmakers inserted language barring significant retirements to avoid capability gaps while delays in replacement programs continued. In the face of ongoing mission demands and a persistent shortfall of tanker aircraft, decisions were made repeatedly to retain older KC-135s far longer than planned and fund additional service life extension programs. The Air Force didn't always want this. But Congress gave them no choice. And here's where it gets interesting. The Air Force is now contemplating keeping the KC-135 in service until 2050. Not because they think it's a good idea, but because every alternative introduces transition risks that the system cannot tolerate. So here's the final truth. The KC-135 didn't survive because it's the best tanker ever built. It survived because every alternative designed to replace it has failed to do so cleanly. Serious, until the United States can replace every KC-135 mission without reducing global reach or accepting operational risk, the aircraft will remain. So, do you think the KC-135 proves that older platforms can outperform newer ones through upgrades and sustainment, or is it just proof that military procurement is fundamentally broken? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this deep dive valuable, hit that subscribe button.